Trowbridge is a town particularly rich in surviving industrial sites associated with the textile trade. Local historian and acknowledged expert on the West Country woolen industry, Ken Rogers, has claimed that it would be probably difficult to find anywhere else in the country, and so the world, within a space of a quarter of a mile, a water factory of around 1800 and steam-driven factories of 1815, 1828 to 36 and 1860, all in their original condition. In their Trowbridge Cloth Trail leaflet, the Civic Society has argued that this collection of buildings has the potential to create an open-air museum of national importance. This video celebrates the buildings of the cloth industry by taking a walk around the town's many surviving buildings. The sources are two leaflets by Trowbridge Civic Society, the Trowbridge Industrial Trail and the Trowbridge Cloth Trail, and the book The Textile Mills of South West England, published by English Heritage. How did all this come about? Trowbridge has been an important town for the manufacture of woolen cloth since the 14th century. By the 17th century, with less emphasis on heavily fulled and dyed cloths than Gloucestershire, which required greater access to water power, the manufacture was increasingly based in the towns rather than the rural areas. Factory working developed in the 18th century, but at that stage was restricted to sites where they could be water-driven. The River Biss was too small to drive large groups of water mills, but provided enough water for early boilers and steam engines. Steam-driven mills began to take over in the early 19th century and were given a big stimulus by the opening of the canal network in 1810, which enabled coal to be brought in from Somerset. This led to the development of an industrial corridor along the course of the river. Homeworking had always been a feature of the textile trade. From the mid-18th century, new types of cloth, such as the cassimere, patented by Francis Yerbury of Bradford-on-Avon in 1766, were introduced, which were commonly made on narrow looms. These could be installed in domestic workshops, and the production of cassimeres has been associated with the increased building of cottages and workshops in Trowbridge in the early 19th century. But these also paved the way for the introduction of power looms in factories, and home weaving had largely died out by around 1850. Mechanisation was sometimes resisted, as the burning of the mill at Semmington in 1803, which led to the execution of Thomas Helliker, illustrates. In the second half of the 19th century, Trowbridge became the most important factory town in the West of England woolen area, but decline began to set in around 1880, although the last mill, Home Mill, only closed in 1982. But Trowbridge has been fortunate in that most of its early mills have survived in new uses. This is a heritage that we should make the most of. We start our walk at the Halve. This contains several three-storey, late 18th century houses, likely to be occupied by middle-grade clothiers. At the Hilperton Road end, number 13 was built around 1815 by a shear grinder. Turning into Roundstone Street, we arrive almost immediately at Yerbury Street, which contains perhaps the best surviving group of workers' houses, dating from the late 18th and early 19th century. The large windows on the third floor lit workshop space for weaving, jenny spinning and other processes that could be done at home. Opposite, on the site now occupied by the modern flats, once stood Yerbury Street Mills, gutted by fire in 1952. Returning to Roundstone Street, Lovemead House, now the Conservative Club, was built by William Temple about 1730 and was lived in by successive clothiers for over a century. The wing at the back provided workshop accommodation. Opposite, on the corner of Polbarn Road, is Polbarn House, built in 1789 by John Clark, minister of the Tabernacle Church and clothier. On the opposite corner, Rodney House, now a solicitor's office, was built in 1790 by another clothier, James Self. Now we turn down Polbarn Road. On the left-hand side, beyond the police station, a large stone-fronted building was originally two large houses, variously known as Rosefield, Homefield and Homefield House. These date from the late 18th to early 19th century, with a new extension dating from the 1960s when it became government offices. Opposite, Lady Brown's almshouses were built for widows by Sir Roger Brown, owner of Ashton Mills and Court Mills. They were built around 1900 and designed by A.S. Goodridge, architect of the Town Hall. Turning right at Magnet Joinery, we come to what remains of Court Mills. Courtfield House has a brick frontage of 1754, built onto an earlier house. The long windows on the east side indicate workspace, while the lower wing to the west was a domestic-type workshop where finishing processes could be carried out under the clothier's supervision. The building is undergoing major restoration in conjunction with housing development. The main part of Court Mills was demolished in 1967, but between the house and the doctor's surgery is the one surviving range dating to 1848 and now converted to houses. This is the first of the characteristic mill buildings that we have encountered so far, so it is worth pausing to take a look at some of the details, as we will encounter them several times again. It is a long 3-storey building with 14 bays. The 2 upper floors are of brick, while the ground floor is of ashlar stone. Stone is also used for the coins, the sill band and the distinctive window surrounds on the upper 2 storeys. This style of segment-headed window with a central mullion features on several of the early 19th century mill buildings in the town. With the presence of County Way close by, it is difficult to realise that Court Mill was once adjoined by Ashton Mill, either side of the Paxcroft Brook. Now it requires a walk through the underpass. We emerge on West Ashton Road, opposite a lane which runs down the side of Ashton Mills, which we now follow. Ashton Mill was the last of the 19th century mills and shows important differences to the earlier factories. Designed by C&R Gain, who were responsible for many of the town's mills, it was built in 1860. It has a deep plan, in contrast to the fairly narrow plans of the earlier factories, made possible by gas lighting, which meant it could accommodate the larger machinery then in use. It also differs from most of the other mills in that it is built of dressed stone. Also gone are the distinctive central stone mullions on the windows. The complex also includes a surviving single-storey weaving shed with its north-lit sawtooth roof, the only one surviving in the town. Weaving was the last process to be mechanised, and the last handloom weavers were working into the 1870s. This mill was owned by Sir Roger Brown in the late 19th century. Now we follow the underpass into the park, which we cross following the line of the Biss to reach the greatest concentration of surviving mill buildings centred on Court Street. Before we come to Court Street, we pass the St Stephen's Place leisure complex, itself formerly the site of a substantial mill complex, Victoria Mills and Upper Mills, built in 1835-7 and altered in 1878 after an arson attack said to be by the owners. The mill closed in 1974 and was demolished in 1980 to make way for the original Tesco supermarket before eventually becoming the leisure park. This old photo of Upper Mill and Cradle Bridge Mill is taken from somewhere near Domino's Pizza. Across the road, the stretch of the river between Cradle Bridge and Town Bridge was lined by a virtually unbroken sequence of mill buildings, many of which still survive. These are best viewed from Court Street. On the west side of Cradle Bridge was Cradle Bridge Mill on the site of the car park at the end of Court Street. By 1917 it was occupied by Messrs Yates, bedstead manufacturers, and later by Messrs Chapman's, mattress makers. They later changed their name to Airsprung, whose factory on Canal Road is one of the town's major employers. As we carry on up Court Street, we come to the three best preserved mill buildings, one after the other on the left, not forgetting the Jenny factory and distant views of more weavers' houses in Castle Street on the right. Before that, we can note that a dye works used to stand on the site now occupied by Monaghan's on the left, while the car park was the site of Castle Court Mills. The Jenny factory, now Court Mill House, is on the corner of Court Street and Mill Street. It is a three-storey brick building from about 1830 and was known to be in use in 1836 for jenny spinning, which did not need steam power as the jennies were hand-worked. This has now been converted to flats. Castle Mill, now known as Andhill House, is arguably the finest surviving mill building. It is of 5 storeys plus an attic, and was built in 1828 by Charles and Richard Gain for John Stancombe. It is built of brick with stone surrounds for the windows and string courses. The windows have the same segment-headed arches and central stone mullion that we saw at Court Mill. By 1836 a parallel block was added to the rear, which, together with a connecting wing, formed a secure private yard. The steam engine was located at the south end of the front block, where the bottom of the chimney can still be seen. The boiler house was in the end 2 bays where AM Copy is now located, and a Bolton and Watt beam engine in the 3rd bay under the window with the semicircular arch. Next on the left is Brick Mill, a 4-storey brick-built range dating from 1815 and also once powered by a Bolton and Watt steam engine at its south end. This was the first factory to be built after the sale of the then open land for the erection of factories in 1814. Note again the now familiar window design with its central mullion. At the back of Brick Mills is the Meadow Works, a modern industrial estate built on land where the river used to run right at the back of the mill buildings. Further up is Stone Mill, built at right angles to the road. This was built close to the site of the ancient mill associated with Trowbridge Castle, and stands on the site of a water mill used for fulling in the 16th century. The lower part of the range was a water-driven factory of the 1790s, the oldest in town. It stood across the mill leat from which it obtained its power until 1819, when it was also fitted with a steam engine. The mill leat formerly ran further east than the River Biss does now, right along the backs of the mill buildings. The lack of any sign of mill ponds indicates that it contained sufficient water for the steam plant, which enabled the factories to be built so close together. A passageway leading between Stone Mill and the Shires leads down to the Riverside Walkway. Turning right, the Riverside Walk takes us past another area once containing two large factory complexes, one on either side of the river. Studley Mill stood on the west side of the river. The area of the Asda car park was once occupied by Sawtooth Northlight weaving sheds, added to the mill in 1865. But the main mill building survives and is now being converted to flats. Built for J&T Clark by the Gain brothers in the late 1850s, it is now known as Clark's Mill. This building has the typical wide plan and larger windows that characterised the mid-19th century mills that were designed to accommodate larger machinery in well-lit interiors. Gothic influences can be seen here. Windows with their central mullions have been replaced by larger windows with two-centred arches that are distinctive to the area, and narrow lancet windows are used. On the other side of the river, opposite Studley Mill, on the site of the supermarket at the bottom of Wicker Hill, was Bridge Mill, of which nothing now remains. The old photo, taken from somewhere around the bridge leading from the Shires to Asda, shows another handle house, now long gone. Around Studley Mill are a number of other interesting buildings associated with textile manufacture. On our previous walk we noted the Handle House of around 1844, with its perforated brickwork used for drying teasels for use in raising the nap on the cloth. Bridge House on the south side of the town bridge was built in the early 18th century and was the home of Henry by the Sea from 1778 to 1814. It was partly destroyed by a stray bomb in 1942, hence its asymmetrical appearance. Beside it are workshops dating to the same time as the house. South of that, on Stallard Street, are a rare group of fine warehouse buildings. The largest belonged to Studley Mill and was built in 1878. Next to it are buildings used by firms of cloth merchants in the 1860s. Across Stallard Street is Inox Mill, rebuilt in 1875 in a style similar to that of Studley Mill. It became part of the Bowyer's factory and is now to be restored as part of the redevelopment of the site. Now we head into town up Wicker Hill. At the start of Fore Street on the left-hand side is the Parade, the finest group of clothiers' houses that we noticed on our previous walk. Fore Street contains good examples of the gradual addition of workshops to the backs of 16th to 18th century houses. For example, 2 to 3 Fore Street, Barclays Bank and Goff's, is an older building refronted by the clothier John Mortimer when he bought it in 1700. Workshop extensions were added in several phases, starting with a 17th century wing, later raised to 4 stories. It has a distinctive tall attic, supported by joint cruck trusses and lit by wide workshop windows. Further up is a 3-story Italianate building, which originally housed the offices of Samuel Salter's home mill. Behind all this, on the site of the medieval castle, was Home Mill. It was built in 1862 after a fire had destroyed earlier buildings on the site. It has an elaborate design of brick with stone facings, and like many later mills has a deep plan. It was rebuilt in 1931 after fire had again damaged the building. This time the top floor was removed. Home Mill was the last mill to close, and much of its building has been incorporated into the Shire's shopping centre, where it now houses the Trowbridge Museum. Passing Lloyd's Bank, once perhaps the finest of the clothiers' houses, we enter the Shires at the junction of Fore Street and Castle Street, and we soon find the entrance to the museum, which is housed above the shopping centre. Taking a quick detour a further 100 metres brings us to the frontage of the Bethesda Chapel, later incorporated into Home Mill by Samuel Salter, and which is now a cafe. The mill and former chapel were once side by side on Court Street. Returning to the museum, we can see its important collection of machines that would have been used in the buildings we have been exploring. A carding machine disentangles, cleans and aligns the fibres. A spinning mule would spin the carded wool into yarn. The spinning jenny is a multi-spindle spinning frame which dramatically reduced the amount of work needed to produce yarn. A worker could now turn just one wheel and be able to spin up to 120 lengths of yarn at once. Here is an example of a dobcross loom, which carried out the weaving to produce the cloth. Fulling was a noisy process which involved pounding the woven cloth over and over again, cleaning and shrinking it. A teasel gig would raise or tease the nap of the cloth using natural teasels dried in one of the handle houses. This was then cut down, leaving the surface smooth and fine. These processes were once carried out in the historic collection of buildings that we have visited.